Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's always so exciting to see how much enthusiasm there is for this event, and I'm just glad that you're all here, eager to learn about the AMCAS personal statement and perhaps about med school applications more broadly. My name is Robert Tinkle. I received my PhD from Johns Hopkins in English in 2020, and I'm now a postdoc currently directing the Writing Center. And I just want to extend a really heartfelt thank you to the Office of Pre-Professional Advising for organizing and hosting this event and having me here to speak to you tonight. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Writing Center, I do have a slide on the Writing Center at the end of this presentation. So we'll go over some sort of basics about who we are and what we do. So stay tuned for that. So this presentation is going to be called the AMCAS Personal Statement, the Do's, the Don'ts, and Staying True to You. So first things first, what is a personal statement? What is this document that we are looking at and talking about today? Well, as you probably know, most admissions committees rely quite heavily on the personal statement in their decision making. Why is that? Well, it helps the committee to gain quite a bit of insight into your personal motivations, desires, your perspectives about this kind of work and study, your goals. In essence, they're able to, quote unquote, hear you in your own voice. So other aspects of your application, for lack of a better term, are a lot of sort of facts and figures about you, right? It's your CV or resume, your transcript, your GPA, maybe a list of your extracurricular activities. But this is really a way for you to sort of come alive as a candidate for the committee, to sort of show them what a sort of well-rounded three-dimensional human being you are. So you should really think of this, you know, it might seem daunting right now to sort of think about writing one of these, but you should think about this as actually a quite wonderful opportunity to convey things that aren't already conveyed in other parts of your application. So, you know, you have a works and activities section where you'll be able to write some sort of short responses. You have, as I said, your resume, your transcripts, and so on. But this is really, you know, your opportunity to speak, as it were, to the committee and to tell them things about yourself that are otherwise perhaps not apparent in the rest of your application. And I think this is important to touch on too. Being able to write an effective personal statement shows that you are able to synthesize and distill a lot of complex information in a succinct way, which is something that's actually going to be vital to the profession itself, right? If you're a doctor, you know, you're meeting with patients who, you know, most of the time are not medical specialists themselves, right? So you are coming into the room as a specialist and need to sort of communicate potentially very complex information to that patient. So, you know, writing a personal statement is actually in a lot of ways good practice for how to speak to a kind of general audience. In this case, it's also an anonymous audience because you don't actually know who is sitting down and reading your statement. So this is, again, good practice for sort of being the expert, right? You are an expert about your own life. You're an expert about sort of who you are and what you bring to the table. So this is a good way for you to practice distilling some of that information and sharing it to a kind of to an audience. Now, for better or for worse, I think mostly for better, there is no magic formula to writing a personal statement. So, you know, the committee is not sort of waiting for you to sort of drop any particular buzzword. They're not looking for you to describe any particular experience or other. This really is a quite open-ended document, and you'll see, you know, often the prompt for the personal statement is left pretty broad, pretty intentionally vague, and that's to give you space to sort of be creative and to sort of do with this document what you want to do with it. So you should really also use that to your advantage. That said, there are, of course, more effective and less effective ways of doing this. So part of what we're doing tonight is going over sort of what differentiates a more effective from a less effective statement. And I want you to think of your personal statement as an argument, right? This is your chance to persuade. You do not write a personal statement the same way that you would write a more traditional academic essay, say for one of your courses. But, you know, most pieces of at least public-facing writing or writing that is meant to be read by some intended audience or other is in some fundamental way always argumentative writing, right? You are always making some kind of argument. You are always attempting to persuade your reader of something or to communicate some kind of important information to them. So while you might not think of your personal statement as having, a thesis statement in the way that maybe some of the papers you wrote for class did, there is a thesis here, right? And the thesis is, this is why I am a strong candidate, and this is why I belong in your medical program. So everything in your statement needs to be oriented toward persuading the reader, right, that that is true, whether that's explicitly or implicitly. There's an act of persuasion happening here. As you probably know already, but I think it does bear emphasizing, committees read a lot of these every year. And by a lot, I mean hundreds, if not thousands of these yearly. So a kind of daunting question then emerges: how are you going to stand out? And I know that question sounds very scary. You might have no idea yet sort of how to begin approaching that. But as we're going to sort of talk about on the next slide, authenticity really is sort of the name of the game here. So I think that the more authentic you are and the more authentically you can write about your own individual experiences and perspectives, that is going to be the thing that helps you to stand out. That is the thing that is going to make you into a fully three-dimensional candidate for these programs. So we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, so as far as I see it, you really have two main objectives in your personal statement. The first is to answer this question: why medicine, as compellingly as possible? And by why medicine, I mean, why not pursue a law degree? Why not pursue a graduate degree in the humanities, right? What is it about medicine particularly that draws you in? What are you attracted to in this study? How did you sort of get on this path to begin with? So, theoretically, there are lots of ways you could spend, your post-undergraduate education. Why is medicine the correct or the most sort of fulfilling or desirable path for you? Now, again, I'm sort of beating on the same drum here a lot, but there really are thousands of possible approaches to this, and that's because your story is, of course, yours and it's unique to you. I often say there are as many ways to write a personal statement as there are people, right? Because your personal statement is your story. There are as many stories as there are people to tell them. So it stands to reason that there are many stories to tell and many possible ways of telling those stories. The second objective, I think, is to, again, persuade your reader that you are ready for rigorous graduate level study. And I think really the word I want you to hone in on there is ready. It's wonderful, of course, in your statement to show interest. It's wonderful to show passion. But I think alongside that, what you also want your statement to convey is that you have the maturity, right? And you have the skill set, and you have a certain amount of know-how to sort of begin to now enter this medical program and begin to become a fully fledged professional in this field. So your statement needs to also, even though it is personal, it does need to also convey a certain amount of maturity and professionalism alongside your sort of interest and passion for the subject. And that's because the next 8 or maybe even 8+ years of your life are going to be spent studying this field in depth. So admissions committees want to feel sure, they want to feel confident that you have the toolkit to succeed in this, again, rather rigorous, demanding, long haul program. So they want to feel confident that you're going to be able to hit the ground running on day one. Again, authenticity is key. Authenticity is really, again, the name of the game here. So you want to ask yourself, does the statement sound like me, right? Does it truly reflect my story? Not someone else's story, not the story that I think the committee might want to hear, but does it really, truly, genuinely reflect myself, my real motivations for pursuing this kind of study, my real ambitions and desires, and does it also reflect sort of what I bring to the table? Now, I just want to get out ahead of this early because I think a lot of students, just sort of from poking around online or reading sample personal statements, might come away with the impression that, a successful statement is one that is able to sort of, that has some sort of tragic backstory, right? The author either, unfortunately suffered some kind of terrible family tragedy at some point in their life, or maybe they sustained some kind of injury, in high school or college that it took, a year to sort of work through and rehabilitate from, or some sort of illness. If that really is your story, right, and if that is the story that you want to share and feel comfortable sharing with the committee and think that you can tell in a compelling way, then by all means, please do approach this personal statement with that sort of story in mind. But of course, that's not everybody's story, right? And if it's not your story, you don't want to pretend that it is, or sort of stretch some truth to sort of to make that the case for yourself. So only take this approach if that really is your authentic experience, but it's certainly not the only possible approach. So I just wanted to sort of reassure you now that there are excellent personal statements written that don't bring in sort of any tragedy at all. And this also goes for sort of similar advice, that you don't need to write a statement that centers the pain of other people or other communities either. If you've done a lot of like great advocacy work with a vulnerable population and you want to talk about it, that's wonderful. By all means, go for it. But again, if that's not your story, don't try to tell a story that's not yours. And I think what this all amounts to is that your personal statement should inspire what I'm going to call a positive gut reaction in your reader. And that's because they may only read it through one time. And that might seem kind of scary as well, to think that you spent so much time crafting the statement, spending a lot of time thinking about what you want to describe, what you want to talk about, and to have someone only look at it once might feel a little scary. But again, admissions committees, they have to read a lot of these every year, and I think what's key to take away from this is that again, use this to your advantage. It's probably not going to be the case that a single word in your statement makes or breaks your application. Not everything is going to hinge on that sort of granular level of detail. Now, that doesn't mean don't spend a lot of time carefully crafting the most well-written statement that you can produce. Of course, you should do that. But this is to say that you also want you want a kind of holistic approach here, right? You want the takeaway, the sort of the big picture takeaway from your statement to be a good one, a positive one, right? You want your reader to sort of read through your statement, take their eyes off the page, and feel confident that you are somebody who is a strong, viable candidate for a program like this. So think big, right? Think big picture. Of course, also, pay attention to detail and draft and redraft and edit and edit some more, and be careful with your language. But you also want to keep in mind that if this is only going to be read potentially one time, and I think you should write this assuming that it's only going to be read through, carefully one time. Think about what kind of effect you want to leave your reader with. Okay, this slide is titled, "What's your sign?" I'm going to make a little bit of a light sort of astrology metaphor that might not be clear to you at first, but hopefully it becomes clear by the end of the slide. So we'll start by acknowledging that answering this question, why medicine, might feel very daunting, right? Where do you even begin? So we're going to address sort of some at least brainstorming strategies here for getting started. So before you begin writing, I think it's a really good idea to draft up a list of the personal qualities or the personal traits, characteristics, things about yourself that you hope to convey to your reader. And together, this list is going to make up what we'll call your personality profile. So some examples of qualities are things like curiosity, patience or perseverance, especially through difficulties or challenges. Maybe you want to emphasize your meticulousness and attention to detail. Maybe it's your ability to work on a team, to work well with others. Perhaps you have a passion for social advocacy, ability to effectively and quickly problem solve. The list could go on and on and on, right? This is certainly not an exhaustive list. These are just some examples of the kinds of things you might want to come up with. And of course, those things should ring true to you. So you want to think seriously about what you bring to the table. Again, not just what you think the committee wants to hear, not just something that's aspirational for you, but something that you really do think you do well, and that you have to offer a program like this. And again, not just one thing. So come up with a whole list, of ideally at least 4, 5, 6 sort of personality qualities or traits that you think reflect your strengths. Next, so you'll have kind of a second list alongside this one. You'll want to sort of carefully select a small handful of experiences through which you can convey or demonstrate those qualities. Now, with both these lists, you might end up with very long lists initially. You might have a list of 20 personality traits and 10 experiences. You will want to eventually sort of pare those down. But in the end, hopefully what you end up with is a good sort of succinct list on both sides, list of personality traits and a list of a sort of small, carefully selected list of experiences. Now, here's where I think the astrology metaphor comes in. So you want to keep in mind here that a personality trait on its own is almost never inherently meaningful, right? It always has to be contextualized. So if we look at our little star chart over here, we've got Aries at the top of the zodiac. Somebody who is, more versed in astrology than I am could probably rattle off, a list of 5 to 10 adjectives, right, that come to mind when they hear Aries. Or, similarly for some of these signs down here, Virgo or Sagittarius, right? Personality traits are very often meaningful in context. They're meaningful in a larger ecology or environment of other, related personality traits, or they come through sort of in behaviors, in activities, and experiences. So that's to say that, a lot of people will say, I'm a very compassionate person, and that's why I want to be a doctor. Okay, that's great. Great that you're compassionate, but compassion can take a lot of different forms, right? And it can be channeled to a lot of different uses as well, right? There are teachers who are compassionate. There are firefighters who are compassionate. There are artists who are compassionate. So it doesn't quite answer the question, why medicine, right? Just to say, I'm compassionate, therefore I should be a doctor. There are lots of ways to be compassionate. Compassion on its own is only meaningful either vis-a-vis other related characteristics or sort of in the ways that it comes through in activity, in behavior, etc. So this is why I say you need a list of several traits, and then you want to sort of figure out what traits make most sense together, sort of vis-a-vis one another. So to sort of like move from an astrology metaphor over to a sort of related Myers-Briggs personality test metaphor, you have these two personality types on the Myers-Briggs scale, ENTJs and ESFPs. Both of these personality types are extroverts, right? That's what the E stands for in both of these. But their extroversion manifests very differently, and that's due to the influence of the other letters that come alongside that E. So ENTJs, for example, are described as strategic, articulate leaders who can identify and solve problems, whereas ESFPs are described as vivacious, charming entertainers who can work a crowd. So you probably have a very different vision in your head of who these two people are, right? They're both extroverts, but based on the description of the ENTJ, you probably have in mind, a president, a community organizer, someone who's a leader in their community in some way. Whereas with the ESFP, you might be picturing, a comedian, a musician, some kind of entertainer, right? So these are two very different people that we have in our head here. Even though they're both extroverts, right? The extroversion takes on a different coloring based on sort of what else is going on in this person's personality profile. So this is something you want to sort of keep in your own head as you begin to describe yourself, right? You're a lot more than just one thing. So always sort of do justice to your own sort of very, big three-dimensional personality, and think of sort of the ways that these characteristics exist in an environment or in a certain ecology with each other. Okay, so as you brainstorm experiences, you want to be asking yourself a lot of why questions. So let's say, hypothetically, for the sake of example, you are actively involved in tennis, and this is something you want to write about in your personal statement. Okay, so you want to ask yourself a question like, okay, why tennis, right? Why do I love playing tennis? Why do I spend so many hours a week playing this competitively or for fun, whatever the case may be? And the answers you come up with here might be, well, it challenges me to stay alert. It challenges me to anticipate my opponent's next move, to react accordingly, and so on and so forth. That's great. Now you have a list of sort of motivations, attitudes that sort of inform your interest in and your practice of tennis. Now what you want to do is you want to sort of flip that back and ask yourself, turn these motivations and attitudes into a kind of identity, and ask, what does this reveal about me, right? Well, it reveals that I love strategy, I'm a good problem solver, right? The ability to anticipate your opponent's next move is an act of problem solving. I create high pressure situations, and so on. So here you have two really great lists now to work with of, again, sort of attitudes, motivations, desires, alongside these kinds of identity markers. Or if we use another example, let's say you're a polyglot, you love learning languages. You might ask, why have I spent so much of my free time learning foreign languages? And your answer to that might be, well, it expands my thinking. It stretches me. It expands my reach in some way. And then again, what does this now reveal about me? Well, it shows that I'm curious about the world. I'm comfortable with the new and the unfamiliar. It shows that you maybe have a strong memory and can think adaptively. So again, we've got kind of two lists here of behaviors, drives, motivations, attitudes, and then another list of sort of what this reveals or says about me. Now, this is maybe the most important thing. What you want to do after this point is then reflect on how those personal qualities will or could benefit you in your pursuit of medicine. Because remember, we're ultimately answering this question, why medicine? So we always want to make sure that even when we're not talking about medicine, that we're sort of bringing it back to that in some way or other. So if we run with the tennis metaphor, you might say medicine, like tennis, requires strategizing about best approaches in a high pressure or high stakes environment, right? Or if we run with the language example, medicine, like language learning, demands openness to new knowledge and research, requires comfort in the face of the unfamiliar, etc. So you can begin to see that, if you wanted to sort of use, let's say tennis, let's say you wanted to sort of, in order to grab your reader at the beginning and hook them in with a kind of fun opening anecdote, you might talk about sort of being on the tennis court, or recall some sort of anecdote related to that. What you're doing here is you're able to show, hey, these qualities that make me a good tennis player are also the kinds of things that are going to eventually make me a good doctor, right? My ability to problem solve, my love of strategy, my ability to work under pressure, right? And that's a way for you to then sort of both hook the reader in, tell them something about yourself that is interesting, that sort of makes you unique, and then also is able to sort of pivot then to thinking about medicine and to thinking about how these things are going to make you an excellent physician. So as you can see, the how is just as important as the what. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you write this. That's to say that there really aren't right or wrong experiences for you to write about in a statement like this. The way that you execute that and the way that you present that material is often just as, if not more important than what you're writing about. Now, of course, the content itself is also important. But again, it's to say that there are very few experiences that I think we could consider wrong experiences to write about. It's all in the way that you present it. And as you saw from the previous examples on the previous slide, the experiences you write on don't have to be medical ones exclusively. You can talk about extracurriculars, you can talk about music, you can talk about whatever it is you're involved in that isn't necessarily sort of pre-med track stuff. However, if you do write on those kinds of things, make sure that it's abundantly clear to your reader what relevance they do have to studying or practicing medicine. And you really want to make strong, meaningful, sustained connections here, not sort of weak or tenuous connections. But that said, reflecting on at least one non-medical experience somewhere in your personal statement could behoove you. It's not to say that you must do this, but it could. You can certainly use this to your advantage, right? It shows versatility. It shows that you have diverse interests, and it can help you stand out. It can give the committee a kind of window into who you are beyond medicine, right? As long as you're able to make that connection and say, this thing that I do is still relevant to medicine in some way, or the personal qualities it shows about me are relevant to the study of medicine. As long as you're able to make that connection, then this is actually a wonderful approach to take. And on the flip side of that coin, if and when you do write about medical experiences, don't get too lost in the weeds describing your research or publications or clinical experience or whatever it might be. That's because there are other areas of the application for you to do that. This is a personal statement. This is not a research statement. So this is the space where you want to reflect on what's personally meaningful to you about those experiences, right? Again, in ways that don't necessarily come through in other parts of your application. So the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself when writing about medical experiences are, did I discover something that I'm especially passionate about in this work or in this research? What obstacles maybe did I have to overcome? And those obstacles could be emotional, they could be intellectual, they could be social or political. What assumptions maybe did I have to unlearn? And those could be assumptions about yourself, They could be assumptions about, the field at large. Did this experience open my eyes to something I maybe had never considered before, right? You can say, I went into this thinking that I wanted to study this thing over here. And, through this experience and, X, Y, and Z happened. It turns out I actually, am passionate about this thing over here that I never thought I would be. So it's a way to sort of walk your reader through your own personal journey of discovery, right? What are you now able to offer having had these experiences? What does the reader learn about you through these experiences? You've probably heard this adage before, but it's so true of personal statements that showing is greater than telling. So your reader should be able to draw these conclusions about you on their own based on what you've shown or demonstrated to them. You don't want to simply say, I'm compassionate. You want to show compassion. You don't want to simply say, I'm a hard worker. You want to show that you've been a hard worker, by sort of describing in detail projects that you've been involved with and how you approach those and what your thinking was, and so on. Or another way to put this is that you want to show and then tell. So it is okay, especially kind of at the end of your statement, maybe in that sort of final short conclusion, to kind of lay your cards on the table a little bit more and say, here's why I'm a good candidate, I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other thing. But all of that is only going to ring true for your reader after they've already seen the evidence of it, after they've already seen those characteristics in action. So in some ways you have to earn the description, right? And your reader will be on board with you if they've seen it themselves. So at that point, it is okay to sort of, to state things a little bit more explicitly, but you really have to show it first. Okay, so here we reach, maybe the fun part of the presentation. These are common mistakes that students tend to make writing personal statements. These are all mistakes that I've seen, having looked at a lot of these at the Writing Center. So it's good that you're here now. We can sort of get out ahead of these mistakes up front. So the first one, and I see this, quite often, is what I'm calling the grand destiny. So this is sort of the rhetorical move of saying, I always knew that I would be a doctor, or I was born to do this, or ever since I was young, I felt fated to, become a nurse, just like my cousin, who's awesome. The problem with that is that it almost always feels pretty inauthentic. It's not really the case that most people know their whole life trajectory when they're very young. It's easy, I think, for us to think that we do, because there's something about sort of being where you are now. It's easy to sort of project backwards and say, oh, this is sort of what I always knew would happen. But it's often not really true that life sort of unfolds that way. And in any case, the committee is much more interested in learning how you have grown, matured, and developed into the very accomplished, very well-rounded candidate you are today. So you don't need to convince them that this is sort of your destiny, that this is something you've always been interested in. The longevity of your interest in this thing is not necessarily going to be the thing that works in your favor, right? The committee is a lot more interested in learning sort of how you got here and not just being told that you were always sort of meant to be here. So what to do instead is reflect meaningfully on your own process of growth and discovery. The next mistake is what I call the memoir. This is, in a lot of ways closely related to the grand destiny. This is the move of saying, when I was 5, I had a grandparent who was very sick, and that was a difficult experience for me. And then in high school, I began to take science classes and learn more about the human body. And then in my sophomore year of college, I began to do research on the illness that my grandparents suffered from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the problem with this is that, like the grand destiny, it really kind of ends up reducing your actually very multifarious interests and experience to a rather oversimplified timeline. And it's also just too big in scope. So, the personal statement, while it is about you and while it is a personal document, it's not actually supposed to be the story of your entire life. It's not a full autobiography. So you don't need these kinds of chronological markers that begin in childhood and, sort of go up through middle school, high school, and then come up through college in the present day. It's much more effective to sort of keep the focus on the present. Again, select, a very small handful of experiences that will offer kind of window into who you are and into what specifically makes you suited for medical school, rather than trying to encompass all the kind of highlights or, milestones of your entire life up to this point. And when I say keep the focus on the present, that doesn't mean literally the present moment. Obviously, if you're writing about, your experiences, theoretically, most or all of those experiences happened at some point in the past. But I think the key here, what I'm trying to draw out here, is that you always want to think about how those past experiences inform the present, right? How do we sort of draw a line from those experiences to who you are now, right? What did you learn or gain from those experiences? You don't want to just keep them in the past. Like, this happened, the end, right? You want to be able to show how that event or that experience continues to influence who you are now. Okay, the third mistake is what I call the glorified resume. This is the move of saying, here's what I did during X, and here's how I felt during Y, and here's the whole list of my responsibilities in Z, or like, here's the list of extracurricular activities I've been involved in. The problem there, as you might imagine, is that the committee can already see that information on your CV or your resume. So you don't need to sort of use this space to rehash it for them. So what to do instead is to emphasize depth over breadth. Again, select one or a small handful of experiences that have some personally meaningful takeaway for you. There are very excellent, effective personal statements that have been about one thing. That the writer sort of takes one significant experience in their life and really sort of fleshes it out in detail for the reader. I would say that if you do more than one, if you have a small handful of experiences, really try to keep this under 4. So 2, 3, at most 4 experiences, and that's because, as you know, personal statements are on average 1 to 2 pages long. They're not, often that is single space, but this is still not a very long document. Once you sort of start talking about more than 4 experiences, you're probably stretching yourself a little bit too thin. You're not able to really go into depth about any of those experiences if you have too many. So this is why it's a really good idea to try to limit yourself to 2 or 3, even as few as 1, really no more than 4. Okay, the next mistake is what I call the damage control. This is the move of saying, here's why my GPA is maybe not as high as I would have wanted it to be. Here's why I didn't take that really important prereq course until my senior year. So this move of explaining gaps or discrepancies or potential sort of red flags in your record. The problem here is that there often are other places in the application where you can do this, and B, it really ends up focusing on the negative rather than on what you will bring to the program. So if there is something that you feel is very pressing, that you absolutely need to address, and there's nowhere else in the application to address it, you can. But make sure that you're keeping it brief and that you're ultimately spinning that into a positive. Yeah, so what to do instead is to emphasize your strengths and to have a clear vision of what you do bring to the table. You don't want to go into damage control mode or sort of defense mode throughout the statement. You always want to sort of keep yourself on the offense. And the final mistake is what I'm going to call the fan letter. This is the move of saying, seeing the surgeons work so tirelessly at X hospital, totally inspired me, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or, Dr. 90210 was so knowledgeable and taught me so much, and I want to be a doctor just like they are, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, so while it is certainly okay to acknowledge role models or mentors, people who are important or influential to your progress in this field, you want to keep in mind that the more you do that, the more you are taking the focus off yourself. The committee wants to hear about you. You're the applicant, right? Not the surgeons over at X hospital. They don't want to hear about the Doctor of the Year award winner. They want to hear about you. So again, it's certainly not an issue or not a problem to acknowledge mentors or other kinds of role models, but you always want to do that in a way that sort of brings the focus back to yourself. So what to do instead is prioritize your own experiences, your own assets, your own abilities, and so on. And when you talk about others, treat them as if they were part of your team. And when I say that, I don't mean, don't be arrogant. Don't try to take credit for work that other people did. But that's to say that, if you do want to talk about, an important mentor, don't just say this mentor was so inspiring and I learned so much from them, period. say, this mentor was so inspiring, I learned a lot, and here's what I learned, right? That brings the focus back to you. That shows that you're able to think sensitively, right, about what exactly it is you gained from that experience. So, treating others as part of your team means being able to reflect on what your relationship with that person was like, what you gained from it, what you learned, and always keep the focus in that way on yourself. Okay, so this sort of gets back to sort of show, not tell. This is sort of how you begin to show and not tell at the level of the sentence, right? As you sort of choose words, individual words, and especially verbs. Active verbs are going to help you to tell your story and to share your voice. So the sort of key piece of advice I can give here: use active verbs rather than forms of the verb to be. So example one, you might say, "I am a helpful and compassionate person." This is the kind of sense we want to avoid, right? It hinges on the form of the verb to be, I am, and it simply lists qualities about you, right? Helpfulness, compassion. But it doesn't show those things, it simply states them. So if we turn that verb, that form of to be, into a verb, right? I volunteer weekly at my regional care center for the elderly, much better, right? Because we have a nice sort of verb driving the sentence, volunteer, and the experience of volunteering shows your reader that you are helpful, that you are compassionate. You never had to say the words. You showed it, and the reader now is more inclined to believe that about you. Or example two, this lab research was an exciting experience for me. Again, we're sort of using a form of the verb to be, was, to drive the sentence. So it ends up not being a particularly compelling sentence, right? We don't learn that much about this person from this sentence. We just know that they did some kind of lab research and that they enjoyed it. But look what happens if you change that was into more colorful verbs. I felt confident that I had landed on a new way of approaching the problem. Got a lot of great verbs in there: felt, landed, approached. We want to hear more about this experience, right? We can imagine sort of a whole paragraph developing around this one short sentence. What was the problem, right? What was the initial obstacle that you encountered? How did you begin to sort of discover this new approach? What did that new approach look like? What did you end up learning, right? There's a lot of ways to sort of spin this one sentence out into a bigger, more compelling narrative than there is sort of with that first example. So always choose the specific detail over the general statement, avoid generalities, avoid the kinds of sentences that anybody could write. And the more specific you are about your experience and about you, the more compelling your statement is going to be. So again, showing is better than telling, depth is greater than breadth. Your voice should be confident, curious, and persuasive. And most importantly, it should sound like you, not like someone else, not generic, but it should sound like you. So ask yourself, could anyone have written this? Or is this something that only I could have produced? Is this so unique and true to my experience that it's the kind of thing that only I could have written? Okay, so the big takeaway here, as you prepare to write your statement, dig deep. Ask yourself a lot of why questions. So why do I want to pursue medicine, as opposed to something else I could potentially pursue? Why is med school the best path for me right now? What do I bring to the table? And the more honest your answers are to those questions, I think the easier, and then also the more compelling, easier to write and the more compelling to read your statement is going to end up being. So your answers to these questions should be personal and they should be specific. Again, your answers, not the quote unquote right answers, not the answers you think your reader wants to hear. This is about sort of again finding that balance between the two sort of potential approaches to this. This is neither a memoir or your life story. It's also not a research statement. Rather, this is an opportunity to develop a personal profile, and that hopefully that profile will grab your reader's attention, make them want to invest in you. The next stage often after the sort of written application is interviews. So I think at the very least, what you want your personal statement to do is make your reader say, I want to hear more. I want to extend this person an interview. I want to talk to this person. I have a sense of who they are already because they've done such a good job of being detailed and specific in their statement that now I want to sort of meet them in real life, right, and hear more. So again, this is neither kind of a cold, dry, impersonal research statement. It's also not an autobiography or the memoir of your entire life. It's sort of something in the middle of those. And finding that balance can be tricky. So this is why we've sort of spent some time today going over some strategies for how to begin to do that. Again, the key here is authenticity. Authenticity really is the key to writing an effective personal statement. I believe that if you do speak frankly about your actual experiences, goals, challenges, desires, that your voice will come through and it will ultimately be persuasive. Admissions committees have seen it all, but they've never actually seen you. So this is why your authenticity matters, right? You have your own story to tell, and the more descriptively you can tell it, the more compelling your statement is ultimately going to be. Okay, so as promised, I have my sort of final slide here about the Writing Center. For those of you that might not be familiar with the Writing Center, our hours are Sunday to Thursday from 2 to 10 p.m. This semester, we are operating entirely remotely on Sunday and Thursday, and entirely in person in Gilman 230 on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So if you make a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday appointment, expect that appointment to be held in person. If you make a Sunday or Thursday appointment, you'll have a remote appointment over Zoom. Appointments are conducted one-on-one with a trained tutor and can last up to 50 minutes. So this really is a tremendous resource on campus for being able to sit down with a tutor and have them really give you good, sustained, tailored feedback about your own writing for almost a full hour. So again, tremendous opportunity here. And you can make up to 3 appointments on any given draft. Now, personal statements, because personal statements are a relatively tricky document, they require a lot of sort of revision and revisiting and editing. We fudge that number a little bit sometimes for personal statements. So we will let you have a couple more than 3 appointments for this particular document. So if you're an undergrad, you can make an appointment through Starfish via Blackboard. And if you are a graduate student or recent alum, you won't be able to make your own appointment through Blackboard. So you can email us at writingcenter.jhu@gmail.com, and we can put you on the schedule. Great. So thank you all so much again for being here. Again, it's always wonderful to see how much interest there is in this event. And I hope you were able to learn something. And feel free to reach out to me too if you have any questions. My emails are tinkle1@jhu.edu. And I'm always happy to field questions from students about personal statements. So thank you again.